Thank you so much for joining us today for this afternoon session. My name's Daisy Dunne. I'm a special correspondent at Carbon Brief, which is a UK-based climate publication. So over the last day or so, we've heard a lot about greenhouse gas removal in the UK, both from the research and policy perspective. And now what we're going to do is speak to three experts from other parts of the world to hear a bit about how greenhouse gas removal is developing internationally, and if there's anything that the UK can learn from or contribute to these efforts. So it's my pleasure to introduce the three panelists we have with us. They are all on Zoom, so they should appear momentarily. Dr. Jennifer Wilcox is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the US Department of Energy, and is on leave as the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Jia Li is an Associate Professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She is also the Senior Advisor on Clean Energy for the Shanghai Environment and Energy Exchange and a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield. Dr. Oliver Geden is Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and a Research Associate at the University of Oxford's Institute for Science Innovation Society. Dr. Geden was also the lead author of Part 3 of the Sixth Assessment Report of the IPCC and is a core member of the writing team for the Synthesis Report coming out later this year. Just before I turn to the panelists for some introductory remarks, I just want to remind you can ask questions anytime using Slido. And before we start off, we're going to do a poll. So hopefully that poll will appear before me. And the question for the poll is, on what aspect of scaling greenhouse gas removal in the UK is the UK well placed to make a global contribution? So I'll give you a few moments now to just kind of put your answers in, and hopefully they'll start appearing on the screen. Okay, we've got R&D, quite big. MRV policy. Oh, seeing lots now. Science and research, pay for it, monitoring technologies, sustainability, deployment knowledge, peatlands brackets pool. Okay, great. That's really interesting stuff. Can I first turn to Jennifer Wilcox for her introductory remarks?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here today. Really excited to be talking about this with this group. Talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in the United States at the Department of Energy and the investments that we're making. It's really exciting right now in this space. You might know that in November at COP, we launched the carbon negative shot, which is one of a series of Earth shots released through the Department of Energy. The idea behind that is to create investments across every option within carbon dioxide removal, from the land-based sectors to direct ocean capture to taking CO2 out of the atmosphere with chemicals, minerals, waste biomasses, feedstocks, coupled to carbon capture and storage. So everything is invited in terms of the opportunity for that investment. It's an across DOE effort, which means we have a number of applied offices that are pooling resources on an annual basis over the next decade to invest in really the R&D of this space. And part of the effort is to recognize that today we truly don't know the costs of carbon removal associated with all of the approaches. For instance, what's the cost of planting trees, making sure that they are not reversed in terms of a carbon store over the next 100 years? This isn't something that we really know how to do today in terms of estimating the cost of monitoring and reporting and verifying that the carbon is truly removed on a timescale that will positively impact climate. So part of the effort is to also establish the metrics, baseline carbon removal today, and how that new projects are actually additional and count toward additional carbon removal from the atmosphere. And then two, to estimate and recognize what are the tools that are available to us such that we can monitor over the period of the project and make sure that the removals are durable. And so a lot of the investments for the carbon negative shot is to really make sure that we have a portfolio of options that present durable carbon removals. And then another piece is that we've got the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was passed just late in last year. And specifically for that, this is more at the demonstration scale And of course, demonstrations and first-of-a-kind demonstrations are costly. So we're investing in this space. We have $3.5 billion over the next 5 years, specifically in demonstrations associated with carbon removal, and really broadly looking at direct air capture, not just using chemicals, but minerals and biological feedstocks as well. So really excited about that, investing in this space and hoping that we can get to thousands of tons removal today to millions of tons over the next decade. If we can show that we can get to millions of tons of removal over the next decade in the United States, then we can at least be on the pathway that's required to get to gigatons by mid-century. So that's a big effort. Another piece is that we need to also manage the CO2. Once we separate it from the atmosphere, where do we put it? And so through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we also have $2.5 billion to build out our sequestration capacity in the United States. And so what we're hoping to do over the next 5 to 10 years is invest to have the capacity of CO2 injection deep underground between 60 to 100 million tons of CO2 over the next 5 to 10 years. And also in the United States, we have Environmental Protection Agency that has to approve Class 6 permits for dedicated storage. So we're working alongside EPA to make sure that we can get the wells to be able to really put CO2 in the ground in a permanent and reliable way. And so the idea with the capture or the storage and the verification and validation efforts, $2.5 billion investment, is really to build the capacity so that when you have projects, whether removal or point source capture, that the offtake is taken care of, that the government is investing in that. And all of the infrastructure law funding, the government pays up to 50% of the projects. And so this is a capital investment and we're paying up to 50%. So it's significant. The other piece I'll mention is policy. So in the US, we do have the federal tax credit, 45Q. Today, for dedicated storage, whether it's point source carbon capture or carbon removal from the atmosphere, it maxes at $50 per ton. That is much too low for direct air capture. Right now, there's a bill called Build Back Better. We're hoping that it gets passed, knock on wood. And if it does, then it will be bumped up to above $100 per ton for removal. We also have the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which can trade anywhere around $200 per ton, but it's unclear how long that's going to go for. And a lot of these projects need to be financed over 20 years. And so we really are hoping for the 45Q bump up for the third, fourth, and fifth of a kind type projects. But at least we do have the infrastructure law to support the first of a kind, which are really the most costly, and hopefully to have a broad portfolio of carbon removal opportunities. The last thing that I'll say is I know that this is not just about carbon, this is about greenhouse gas removal. And we also are looking at, in cases that methane is truly stranded, we are looking at methane separation as well, concentrating methane and using it as a feedstock for, say, ammonia. And this could also apply to some agricultural sectors and other natural sources of methane that's truly stranded. Of course, if we can avoid the emissions in the first place, that's always going to be cheaper and easier. But this is another space that the Department of Energy is investing in. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Oliver.
Thank you so much for that really concise overview. Do we have GLE on the line too? I'm hoping we do. Yeah, can I turn to you next for your introductory remarks, if that's okay? Hello, can you hear us, GLE? Or?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Oh, brilliant. Would you mind sharing your kind of introductory thoughts on this topic with us?
Pardon?
Would you mind sharing your introductory remarks on this topic with us? Thank you.
My introductory of what?
So just your thoughts on greenhouse gas removal in the region you're working in and how it's relevant to the UK.
All right, sorry. I didn't hear anything while I was in the waiting room, so sorry about that. So I'm working in China at the moment. Before coming back to China, I was teaching at the University of Exeter and also University of Edinburgh. And at that time, my research area is on carbon capture and storage. So the latest program is that China and the US has signed Glasgow Declaration during the last COP meeting last year. And the area that is relevant to this research is that in one of the agreement, China and US both said they will collaborate together on carbon capture and storage, plus direct air capture. I think with direct air capture first mentioned in international agreement and also a high-level international agreement has already shown a remark. That's basically the first step towards collaboration and also research. And personally, I was involved in a science research project in Shanghai that was funded by the Department of Shanghai Science Technology Forum, or the Office of Science Research. And that was the first provincial level direct air capture project. The total funding is not a lot. So it's only worth 3 million Chinese RMB, and that is about 320,000 pounds, around that figure. And that was the first one. But then this year, there is a latest research call for proposal, and direct air capture is in one of the call for proposal. It's not just as a standalone proposal, but rather as one element of a CCS demonstration project. So it was really starting from the last COP meeting held in Glasgow. Then people start to get aware of the importance of direct air capture. And that was being one of the research that I'm working on. The other area that is also relevant to the greenhouse gas removal technology might be planting more trees that will be linked with the development of the forestation department, but that's not my specialty area. So I think for the science research part, that's what basically showing the importance. And the other one that is rather relevant to this research is some national-owned power company. They've started to consider direct air capture as one of the important research area. And previously, they will only consider probably carbon capture and storage because it can capture loads of carbon dioxide from one emission point. But in order to remove the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere, these has suddenly bring to the topic of the discussion. So that's probably going to be the latest progress in China.
Great, thank you so much for that. Oliver, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much also for inviting me. I'm going to speak on the European Union and on the member states of the European Union. The CDR debate in the European Union is right now mainly linked to the net zero target and the CDR we need to counterbalance residual emissions. And I think that these debates will be increasingly connected over time. The initial modeling on the European Union level, but also on the member states, has around 5 to 10% of 1990s emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as residual emissions, with the usual, let's say, mix you have in developed countries, have even more of it coming from agriculture, methane, nitrous oxide. Many member states who have done modeling in a similar way have similar numbers, 5 to 10% of 1990. But of course, it's at least right now still a theoretical number. The European Union in its climate law has also already a net zero vision, so net zero by 2050, net negative thereafter. Germany has net zero 2045, net negative thereafter. Finland and Sweden have similar formulas. They have earlier net zero dates, but the focus is on net zero right now, and it kind of brings some discipline into the debate, because you really have to look at what can LULUCF removals deliver, and what might you need additionally? As the US, the European Union as a whole has net removals in land use change and forestry, mainly coming from afforestation and reforestation projects. So right now, this is the bulk of it. There has been a debate because it hasn't been done so far when enhancing the 2030 target, strengthening the 2030 target of the European Union from -40 to -55% for the first time to account for the net removals from LULUCF, where then these removals got capped in the way they could contribute towards target achievement. And for 2030, under the Fit for 55 program, the European Commission wants to enhance removals from LULUCF quite a bit. The European Parliament wants to go even more, and the more technological options, which are still at a nascent stage, there are no comprehensive policy programs for that. The European Commission is mainly funding it through the European Emissions Trading Systems Innovation Fund. So it's money coming from certificates. For example, the BECS pilot in Stockholm Exergy combined heat and power plant will be funded through that program. So for the European Union, because the European Commission is the main policy entrepreneur, they're taking it quite slow compared to the UK and the US. Some member states are more advanced. I think Sweden is the most advanced one. The UK was, as long as the UK was part of the European Union. But since there are now policy processes, the member states and also the parliament, they are all making up their minds what their position actually is. So some might still favor LULUCF, or what the European Commission now calls carbon farming for political reasons. Others might be going more towards technological options like direct air capture with CCS and bioenergy with CCS, or enhanced weathering. We're still in the phase to find out. I think the next really big step is a legal proposal by the European Commission by the end of 2022 to come up with the certification mechanisms for a couple of carbon dioxide removal methods. And nobody at this point knows how many and which ones it will be. And of course, you have to restrict yourself to a manageable number of methods where you want to develop MRV systems for. But I think this is a very important first step where the European Union will show which methods to focus on, at least in this decade. And once that starts, of course, the preparation already have started. Member states and the European Parliament will make up their minds what they favor. They have taken a back seat so far. And given that the UK until recently was a member of the European Union, I would say there will be some kind of healthy competition. So Europeans will looking what's happening in the UK. And I think one debate that might influence European Union policy making could evolve around connecting emissions trading of the European Union and the UK, because but only if carbon dioxide removal would become part of the UK's emissions trading system, and you would have discussions about linking these, that might influence European Union policymaking quite heavily. But I think the main action on non-LULUCF removals is to be seen in the European Union interface after 2030. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Oliver. And it's very interesting to hear about the EU, China, and the US, all key places for the climate challenge overall. So thanks very much for all of that. I wanted to ask you all a bit about international collaboration. I think some of you touched on this already, but how do you see international collaboration between the Region News study and the UK working in a kind of better way? And what are the key issues to bear in mind for that? And can I turn to Jennifer first for that one, please?
Sure, thank you. I think collaborations are critical, especially in this space, just recognizing we all live in the same greenhouse. And then I think too, in terms of greenhouse gas removal, it's very different from CCUS, which is really decarbonization of industry, decarbonization of fossil. Not every region is dependent on those in the same way, but for greenhouse gas removals, every region globally has really something to offer to the space. You know, whether it's a land-based approach or direct ocean capture or mineralization or direct air capture, because you've got low carbon energy resources that are readily available. Every region really has something to offer. But what we're lacking internationally is communication of the MRV, of the carbon accounting across the portfolio of approaches. Once we can kind of speak the same language in terms of those metrics and what's going to be critical to ensure durable removals, to quantify removals, it's going to be very difficult to ultimately imagine one region being able to have value to count using their removals to counterbalance another region's emissions. And so I think that we need to figure that out in these first of a kind projects that we're investing in today and really work together, open line of communication to do that. The second piece I'll say is we're talking about building the infrastructure, but we need the human capital too. And so we need more people that are educated in this space from all parts, not just technology but also the STEM fields, communications, engaging with frontline communities, recognizing that we're putting technologies in communities. There's just a huge suite of expertise that really will be required if we're to do this in a way that's responsible, that's just, and that's equitable.
Thank you so much. Gia, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, I think international collaboration is very important, especially on this topic. There was loads of collaboration on carbon, carbon capture and storage previously between the UK and also China. So I was funded by one of the projects that was originally funded with funding from UK FCO office. And at the moment, we haven't seen a lot of funding on carbon direct removal technology yet, but I think it will come given the time. There is also another thing is to bring in more people or young people, especially working in this area in the future. Because if you look at the cost setup for both the UK higher education and also the Chinese higher education division, there wasn't any specific courses just for this technology. There might be some carbon reduction technology or low carbon technology that's available for the young people to choose from, especially those undergraduate or master degree students. But when we are talking about greenhouse gas removal technology, the choice is pretty much limited. And there was a new document sent out by the Ministry of Education in China about a week ago, which was issued on the 7th of May. And it highlights the importance of having education and courses set up for carbon neutrality. I think with that sort of background, there will be more international collaboration and projects going on. And there were definitely some cases where students or people exchange within those two countries, China and the UK, and definitely also China and the US. And one of my students from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, David, he's British and he studied in China. And now he set up a company in the UK. I guess with those more and more small business like those, and when it grow and start to work on the direct carbon removal technology, then we will see it like even getting from the small points with more international collaboration and international research going on. And especially those will basically help the young people, not just with their career, but also with their future living environment.
Thank you very much. Oliver?
Yeah, I think obviously there will be fora for collaboration. At the same time, I think there will be huge competition between these major economic blocs. One area of forum for cooperation that is emerging it's the so-called mission innovation on CDR. A specific one has been launched, led by the US, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. I think it was launched also during COP26. But they are also building on the experience with other mission innovation strands. There are even informal exchange forums that are so informal that nobody really knows about them, and even sometimes within governments. So there's a CDR forum where governments or government representatives talk to each other. But I think what is of utmost importance is what Jen already mentioned, is accounting. Not only in the ways that countries will have to learn from each other, but also ultimately, if as a country you want your removals to be recognized, let's say in your national determined contributions or in your UNFCCC inventory, there need to be standardized rules for accounting. And of course, you could make them up on paper, but you have to develop them in parallel to your experience, to your learning on the ground. And it will take some time, and it will probably also go through another set of IPCC guidelines, because these build the foundation of the UNFCCC guidelines for accounting. And I think this will be an interesting area, because indeed I have been involved in the IPCC work in this area. The IPCC right now only has that word durable or durability in there, but there is no widely accepted definition what might constitute a threshold to durability or permanence. And of course, something that would be below such a threshold is not invalid just because it is impermanent. So you also need rules how to account for impermanence. For example, with land-based biological removal. So I think this will be a strand where countries and governments will be working together, and industry and researchers as well over the coming years and decades, also trying to avoid creating additional loopholes as we see them now. For example, in land-based mitigation accounting, probably if everything works well during these processes, also our LULUCF accounting that we already have can be better, or let's say less worse, because there are some huge gaps in the way we account for removals in that part of mitigation action.
Thank you. Jennifer, it's interesting to hear you mention social equity. I think today and yesterday we've heard a lot about social equity issues from the UK perspective for GGR, but I wonder, could you expand a bit more on what that kind of debate and issue looks like from a US perspective?
Yeah, I think from a US perspective, number one, with a lot of the work that we're doing right now, and we're still a little bit in the early days of getting information out the door, but it's coming soon. And but part of that is too making sure that applicants, when they apply for funding, that they have engagement plans, and that when we're thinking about siting projects at the demonstration scale, that we understand what the impacts are to communities, and that we also can translate those investments to benefits to communities. One of the things one example of that is that when you look at siting direct air capture, we often think about siting it where there's low carbon energy available, where there's geologic storage of CO2 available. But we can also imagine siting it, if those two are also there and available, imagine siting it where there's also high pollution that's hard to avoid today, like ports, for instance. Are there opportunities where we can do this? Because you're not just scrubbing the air of CO2, you can scrub it of other pollutants as well. And so there are going to be co-benefits. Another piece that I think is interesting, as CDR is really just getting started in terms of building out the infrastructure in the US, some of these approaches, when you think about the financing, can the communities be part of that financing? As we look at 45Q as a federal tax credit, there's value to be had if it's priced right. And it would be exciting if communities could invest in these opportunities such that they would actually see the economic value, not just of the removals, but the incentives that are coming from the federal tax credits. And thinking about this in a cooperative financing community way. And so I think that, just brainstorming these types of approaches so that we are starting off in a way that's just and equitable as we roll out the infrastructure that's going to be ultimately required to remove CO2, ultimately at the gigaton scale, that we do it with this type of platform in place at the very, very start.
Thank you. Oliver, do you have anything to add on social equity from the EU perspective?
Well, I think the EU is not there yet. I mean, of course, there is the just transition discourse in the European Union as well, but it relates mainly right now to regions that are to be transformed in terms of coal mining regions or regions where you have high polluting carbon intensive industry. Now the discourse moves to agriculture as well, but there's no talk, let's say, it's more connected to, okay, we take something away from certain communities or regions, so we have to have a just transition from the old state to the new state, and around CDR in terms of siting of installations, we don't have that. We might get that. I can imagine that if you connect it to the residual emissions discussion, and it will be in the political discourse, and the question also is, and it might be in a different way than we imagine it. Okay, can we accept some residual emissions that would maybe not so hard to abate economically, but are hard to abate politically? And can we keep certain infrastructure in certain places because we combine it with carbon dioxide removal? The same applies, probably not under the header of just transition, to responsibilities. If you are working in what is called a hard to abate sector or hard to transition sector, does that mean the CDR that will be allowed to cover that will have to be delivered by somebody else, and you just assume somebody's going to do it and there will be a market for that? Or would the respective sectors be responsible for that? Because what we see right now in the agricultural sector in Europe, they're using the argument, well, science says these are hard to abate residual emissions, so what can we do? Somebody else, please now come up with CDR. This will also be interesting debates and decisions to be made about distributional fairness, who's responsible for the CDR to be delivered, and on the global level as well. You might know that India or some ministers from the Indian government already started demanding that the OECD countries go net negative to leave more carbon space for India and other countries. This might be a debate that will come up on the UNFCCC level as well, because at least theoretically, you can then account for historical responsibility. At the same time, there is a danger that you then move the whole debate into some kind of magical thinking, how we will balance out historical responsibilities in the second half of the century. But yeah, obviously, if you're going to do it at that level within countries and globally, there are equity discussions that we will need to have, and that we surely will have.
Thank you. Gia, can you comment on social equity from a China perspective?
Yeah, sure. This is a very interesting topic, to be honest. And I think when we talk about carbon neutrality in China, people argue whether why do Chinese government consider 2060 to be the year to reach carbon neutrality? Why can't it be 2050 like a lot of other countries were doing? But if you look back of what happened with other countries, for example, UK and Germany probably already reached the carbon peaking around 1990s. So from 1990s to 2050, they will have around 60 years time to go down from the peak to net zero emission. And for China, assuming Chinese government will be able to reach the carbon peaking by 2030, that means it only have 30 years time to reach from the top to the bottom. And for US, probably the peaking time of carbon is around 2005. So it's still got about 45 years of time scale. And that also means it's bringing new challenge and new opportunities for business and also for technology that can help to tackle climate change. Because if we are using just renewable or other low carbon technology to reduce the carbon emissions within those 30 years timescale, it will not be sufficient. So any carbon direct removal technology, and especially those fast developing technologies, that will be very important for not just for China, but also for other countries. So I guess from that aspect, it's bringing a new opportunity and development potential for the greenhouse gas removal aspect. The other things I think is also quite interesting will be to bring in those cost benefit or financial incentives for this industry. Because at the moment, the Chinese carbon market is only limited to power plants that emit carbon dioxide and also large power plants. So that is around 2,200 companies that have the right to trade in their carbon dioxide. And the cost of those carbon, the carbon price is also very low, only about 10% of the current European market price. That basically means if the carbon market price goes high enough, that will bring in more technology to get engaged. And probably at that time, it will not just be CCS technology, but also with bringing direct air capture technology. So that will be the potential business case.
Thank you. It's great to hear the kind of similarities and differences in different parts of the world when it comes to this key issue. And we're going to turn now to questions from the audience because we've got a few coming in. So the first one I can see here is from Paul Rouse. Could the panel say a little bit about how or if they are working with developing countries in their efforts to develop removals? Gia, do you want to start with this one?
You mean working with developing countries?
Yes.
So my background is in education. So the research, if we're working in China, that is definitely one of that. And it's still based on lab scale, but it's getting towards direction of having demonstration project built. So that is the current progress. So compared with the US and probably the European progress, it's much slower, but we are catching up on this topic.
Oliver?
Sorry. Yeah, I think the European Union, because it has decided some years ago to only have a domestic target and not allowing for international offsets to count towards domestic mitigation targets, kind of restricts this debate right now to Europe. If you compare it to the broader mitigation and adaptation agenda, the European Union is quite involved in helping countries, for example, like South Africa, now together with other OECD countries, to phase out coal sooner. But it's quite reluctant to tell developing countries now that they need to invest heavily in carbon dioxide removal. Simply, international equity would demand that that developed countries go first here. And I think there's a problem with the international modeling, the global modeling, for example, within the IPCC, via integrated assessment models, where a lot of carbon dioxide removal is expected to happen in developing countries, like in these models, Latin America goes net zero and net negative first because of the forestry potential. And I think politically, European Union policymakers try to avoid that. They try to keep the CDR discussion a European discussion. At the same time, you can see that developing countries start to accept that if we want to keep 1.5 really alive, that at some point we need to account for even for net negative emissions globally, which seems far away, but are quite reluctant to engage in this discussion because they fear some kind of what you could call mitigation, deterrence, or obstruction or moral hazard in just discussing these issues right now, although I think that might change over the coming years. But I think for the European Union policymakers, it is important to have an own clear understanding what their own responsibility is, and that debate has already has only just started.
And Jennifer?
Sure. So this is something that we've been discussing, thinking about still in early stages, but one mechanism that we've been considering, and it does relate to direct air capture in particular, but some developing countries that are develop or that are producing oil and gas regions, for instance, they also have opportunities for geologic storage and also have workforce and expertise in reversing the flow of carbon deep underground. And some of those regions that we are already working with for more of a reducing carbon intensity associated with oil and gas production through the Net Zero Producers Forum, which we recently just launched as an international initiative. But some of those opportunities, when you can look at having CO2 sequestration regionally, and if there's also low carbon energy regionally, maybe it's geothermal, maybe it's solar. And if we have projects in the United States where we're funding first of a kind technologies at the thousands of ton scale, what if we could accelerate that and do a similar project in one of these developing countries or nations? And so this is something that we're thinking about is using that same technical expertise and maybe that same kind of set of players as we demonstrate in the United States. Can we do that same demonstration in a different part of the globe? And then the other aspect of that, I think some folks will say, but if let's say you're using geothermal in Kenya, are you doing direct air capture or are you producing electricity? And there's this misconception in treatment of direct air capture technologies all being equal. They're actually very different when you look at the different approaches to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And some can actually couple to low quality heat. And so it's not an either or, it's that you can do both. You can produce electricity and you can do direct air capture when using geothermal. And so we see this as an opportunity to actually bring electricity to regions that don't have it today, as well as a co-benefit. And so this is something that we're thinking about, and not carbon removal, but we're also thinking about this for industrial decarbonization as well. Just recognizing cement plants, for instance, the companies, they're not just US companies, they're international companies. And if we're working to decarbonize cement in the United States, why can't we do that in other regions as well with those same partners? And so this is definitely something we're interested in, but still at the beginning stages.
Thank you very much. So a question now from Cameron Hepburn. Where do you think your region has a competitive advantage in GGR? Oliver, I'll come to you first this time.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a competitive advantage in terms of methods, although technical experts might have a different opinion on that. I think the European Union will try to play on the governance and regulation level, and how can you integrate carbon dioxide removal in an overall mitigation policy in a way that it doesn't distort your mitigation policy and makes clear, okay, it is just one part, not the most important part of getting to net zero and getting the regulation around MRV right. I think that's what, at least what the European Union will try to do. Also, as it often has to, because it consists of now 27 member states, how to organize, let's say, a regional distribution of responsibilities and of opportunities, of benefits, but also of burdens, because these 27 European countries are quite different. So if you take a country like Ireland, where 1/3 of the emissions are from agriculture, I would bet they will never get to net zero if they continue to do agriculture like they do. So some countries probably, if Ireland stays on that path, will have to go net negative for Ireland, which will be politically quite interesting discussions to have also in a regulatory way. So I see it more in that sphere, not so much technology-wise. And I think there might be a silent bet that this time, other than with solar, other regions, maybe the US, will buy us the costs down on certain technologies.
Jennifer, can I go to you next?
Sure, I hope we can do that, Oliver, I really do. We're gonna try. So I would say in the US, one of the assets that we have is expertise with injecting CO2 deep underground. So we have a number of geologic formations with capacities that are absolutely adequate to meet the needs for our net zero and ultimately net negative goals. And so this is, but it's also comes with, we've been injecting CO2 deep underground in the US for 40 years now, but on a controversial topic. We've been using it to get more oil out of the earth. And so this is a tricky topic, but it's at the same time, it's why we have the expertise we do. And we also have a lot of depleted oil and gas formations, which are suitable for CO2 storage because they did store and produce oil and gas over millions of years. And so similar trapping mechanisms are what's going to ensure that CO2 is also staying deep underground. And so we're trying to work with industry, leverage that expertise, making sure that, but at the same time that we have guardrails in place such that we're really reversing the flow of carbon and also in a permanent and reliable way. But this is the area where I think we have a lot of leadership and a lot of expertise and opportunity.
Thank you. And Gia?
Well, I think one of the advantage of applying direct air capture technology or other greenhouse gas removal technologies in China is the different combination of heat resources. As Jennifer mentioned just now, we can apply DAC technology, not just as some empty place, but also using the waste heat from probably geothermal and also probably nuclear power plants and other industry facility. With the good industry mix in China, I guess this provides loads of different application scenarios. And if you can, go do a screening on those direct carbon removal technologies, DAC technology and BCCS are those only two technologies that's not likely to create any conflicts if you are going across any borderline of a country border. So with those technology, is something that can be applied and also having technology transfer and also the potential of the carbon reduction will be huge.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more short question. So this one is for Gia. I understand China has been planting many trees. Could you elaborate on the benefits realized and perhaps also the challenges faced?
China is planting a lot, many trees at the moment. And there was estimations on the potentials of how much carbon dioxide it can actually absorb. So we have a number quoting from about 1 gigaton to around 3 gigaton. So that's a wide range. And if you look back on the current emissions in China, the total emission from last year is around 10 gigaton. And going down to carbon neutrality by 2060s will mean that most of those power plants will need to go net zero emission and even negative emissions. And some of those industry plants, because of the nature of how energy or steel or cement is generated, it's not likely it can go to net zero. So that means some of those trees that's being planted will need to offer those extra quota to those industry plants. And that means carbon direct removal will need to be used to meet the gap between those the tree planting and also the emissions from industry. So if you do a backward calculation, then you will be able to find out the potentials of those technologies and also the gap of planting trees in China, even all over China. So I guess that is where the number people are still in discussion with. So it will help, but probably the effort can't really meet the carbon neutrality goal in the future.
Thank you so much. So we are unfortunately out of time. I just want to thank you to all our panelists for joining us, especially from your respective time zones. So that's really massively appreciated. For everyone in the room, we're only having a quick sort of 10-minute break. So if you could be back in your seats in 10 minutes, I think that would be great. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.